So it's my pleasure today to introduce Jeff Sizer, who's the CEO and the founder of Genesis Electronics Design, and I'll leave it to Jeff to describe a little bit more about what the business is. Throughout the course of the presentation, I will be interrupting frequently because the style of these webinars is what I call a radio interview. So Jeff will be starting each slide and expect me to jump in. And if you type in any questions, I'll be able to ask Sam as we go. So Jeff, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Tim, and hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. The topic we'll be talking about design controls, and we'll be explaining what that term actually means and what it actually means for anyone who is developing a medical device and wishes to place it on the market as a medical product. To give an example of medical devices, this is just a small sampling of devices that Genesis has been involved with. Our role in the development of such devices relates to the electronics and software component, and we work with other partners such as design and industry who do industrial design for us, and other industrial designers, and also circuit-wise who do electronics manufacturing for us. So we are one cog in the wheel that takes these sort of devices from concept through to reality.
And I'll jump in there straight away, Jeff, because looking at this screen, one of those devices is not actually a medical device, which is the elderly home monitoring device. We've got it up there because it's sort of pseudo medical, I guess. And when do design controls kick in?
It's a very interesting case because it could be a medical device depending on what it's used for. If it's simply used for monitoring elderly people in their home to alert their loved ones if they're not up and about and moving, then it's not a medical device. But if you were to employ exactly the same technology in an aged care facility as a part of determining if the person, their health and well-being is in order, it could be a medical device. So even though the function is pretty much the same, as what you use it for that counts. If it is a medical device, then design controls apply.
So my first question is, do all medical devices require design controls?
Short answer is yes, by definition. If it's a medical device, it needs to be put on the market by a medical device manufacturer in accordance with the requirements of ISO 13485, the quality system standard, and that standard prescribes what we call design controls. It's quite interesting what that term means, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
The diagram you can see on your screen, I won't talk to that in detail at this stage because it will appear later in the presentation, but it is a clear representation of what the concept of design controls means. The actual term design controls is one that comes from the FDA in the US. It's part of their parlance. It is not defined as a term in ISO 13485, but nevertheless, it has become generally accepted in the industry as a good catch-all to say, what do we do in terms of controlling the design process and recording information? And that diagram is used in one of the guideline documents from the FDA and is in common use in the industry and shows what people like to call a waterfall process or a sequential process down the diagonal, from user needs through to the various steps through to a medical device. And importantly, it shows iteration around the verification and validation loops. You're not expected to get everything perfect on the first pass through this process. So we'll talk about that in a little more detail later on.
So to be clear, design controls is just good engineering practice.
Effectively, it's an embodiment of good engineering practice, which is married up with documentation at a fairly intensive level. It probably goes beyond what most people would expect to see in a commercial product development or particularly a consumer product development. But nevertheless, there's a very strong argument that design controls as prescribed for medical devices are just an embodiment of good design practice.
Okay, let's move on then. So I started to say, do they all need it? But can you just talk a little bit about, why they're needed and why they're important?
Well, starting with the second question, they're important because they are prescribed by ISO 13485, which is mandatory to put a medical device legally on the market. So they're not optional, they're actually prescribed in quite some detail in that standard.
I presume they're prescribed. They're there for a reason.
Oh, they're there for a reason, and that's to maintain good discipline throughout the project and to make sure that the records that are required to be kept are generated as the process progresses. So in terms of who needs to use them, the party that's responsible for them is the medical device manufacturer that puts the product on the market. They are not necessarily the entity that does the actual design and development work. So anyone who's involved in the design and development and also the product definition and specification needs to use design controls throughout the steps in the development process, which takes us nicely to the next slide.
Yeah, and look, this is a slide that Genesis uses all the time, and I might actually just talk to it, and I hope that the audience can see the finer points at the top and the bottom, but I'll talk you through them in case you can't. But this is a diagram which really sort of, I guess, encapsulates the overall product development process, and you can see some of the big functions in the middle, the whole R&D process, and that might start at a university. Typically, industrial designers get involved up front because even before any electronics or software design happens, we need to understand what the whole human experience is. But as we move into the project, quite often particularly for active devices, the whole systems development really takes sort of hold as the key driver of the project. And then as we move towards the back, the manufacturing becomes more important, and also transition into the operations of the actual company, operating and marketing the product itself and the users, obviously. Up at the top there, you can see the sort of some of the big steps. And we've included some of the things like grant applications up there, intellectual property, the whole prototyping process, certification, right through to regulatory approval. So in the course of these webinars, we're actually touching on all of these areas. But what we've included down the bottom there are what we call in the design controls, and each of these topics we're going to touch on today, these all run in parallel right throughout this process, starting right at the front with the user needs, and that's part of that whole discovery process of understanding what it is that you want the product to do, who are the stakeholders involved, all through the planning protocols, procedures, the risk management, design inputs, project planning, change management, a whole heap of stuff around documentation requirements and the review process of the documentation, technical file, design review, verification, validation, design transfer, and manufacturing validation. So let's, unless you've got anything to add, Jeff?
I think the most important takeaway from this diagram is you look at the process flow along the top and the process flow along the bottom. Design controls kick in right at the start of the process, and the various aspects of design control kick in at various steps through the journey. You find a tendency of people to say, I don't want to start thinking about design controls at the start of my project because all it will do is a whole heap of paperwork and a big burden, and it will stifle my creativity, yada, yada, yada. Well, that is one view, but I have a contrary view. I think it's appropriate to undertake the aspect of design control progressively throughout the process. Do that in a smart manner so that you're not actually inhibiting the creativity process by the design control. So in the early stages, they can be somewhat in the background, but nevertheless, make a start on them and start to accumulate information and capture data in parallel with all those creative activities. And then you will be well set up when you get into the core development phase with the information that you need as a feed into that.
One of the things I noticed you mentioned to me the other day is something as simple as having a template of the final document you're going to need, and as you go through the project, and if you get an email with information, rather than just saving that email or putting it in some other folder structure, actually copy and pasting that content straight into the the document. And yeah, it's all messy, but later on you can you know, you're keeping everything managed in that one place.
I think that feeds into one of my sayings, which is less work for a better outcome.
Yeah.
It's actually less work to capture the information into the document, and it preserves that information rather than having it scattered around in notepads and meeting minutes and emails and so forth, and then having to collate it all later.
Okay. So I'll hand this one over to you, Jeff.
As I mentioned before, the term design controls originates with the FDA, does not appear as a definition in ISO 13485, but because it's in common usage and well understood, it's appropriate to use it. And particularly if you're targeting the US market, you are well advised to provide to the FDA inspectors what they are expecting to see. So therefore, certainly there's a bit of a win-win if we adopt the design controls terminology. What I've done in the table at the bottom here is aligned the boxes that appear on the flow chart that we saw earlier with sections of ISO 13485. And you'll see that there's not a one-to-one correspondence, but certainly everything on the flow chart appears in ISO 13485 in a fairly consistent and orderly manner. So by using the flow chart as the guide, you're not going to be heading down a path that diverges from what ISO 13485 is calling for. And incidentally, you'll notice through this presentation at the top, I've included references into ISO 13485 just so that you can note where to find the relevant information that calls up what we're talking about here.
So let's just start off with these user needs, because this is something I've, you know, as an engineer myself, I've been involved in this throughout my career. In medical situations, there's a whole range of different types of users, aren't there?
Indeed, and the term users is a little bit misleading. It really would be better phrased as stakeholders. But if you look at the core users / stakeholders, obviously the patient that the device will be used on to provide therapeutic or diagnostic benefit or whatever the device is there to do. The people who apply that device, the clinicians and medicos, certainly our users, may include laboratory technicians, for example. It's a diagnostic type test. But it also encompasses the manufacturer of the device, the medical device manufacturer, and perhaps you can even consider their investors may have needs that need to be satisfied. The requirements of all of these parties can be captured as user needs. The importance of doing so, which we'll talk in more detail in the presentation, is that the user needs are the starting point of a traceability process of requirements throughout the hierarchy of design documents. It's incredibly important to get them correct. However, you will never get them complete and correct on the first try. You'll certainly be involved in iteration. As you progress down the process, you'll discover additional needs that weren't originally properly addressed in the user needs document, and you'll need to do updates. That's a perfectly acceptable and normal process.
One thing I've noticed sometimes with user needs is you can have things that sort of duplicate or overlap each other. Just how important is it to have each user need sort of almost mutually exclusive from each other?
It's really important to have them extremely simple and clear cut, preferably in terms of one-liners, not to have thousands of them. If you have more than 100 user needs, you've probably strayed into the territory of what we call design inputs, which are in fact the technical specification parameters. So each user need might give rise to 10 design inputs. Good example, the user might say, oh, I need to have a light to tell me the power is on. That is a user need. You will then look through the technical standards and find that a power indicator should be green, and you might want to have a green of a certain spectral characteristic, and it might need a certain brightness, and there might be where it needs to be located on the user interface, etc., etc. So from a simple user need flow quite a number of technical design requirements, but the fundamental user need is they want a power indicator. I put a few dot points there of particular key items that should be considered and included in the user needs. So the indications for use, when is the device used and what's it used for? That would include who's the cohort of patients, who are potential patients that the device should not be used on because they have some condition that makes it inappropriate, etc. So that's important to consider. The term essential performance is defined in IEC 60601-1, and there's a reduced quotation there, but it's a performance of a clinical function where loss or degradation beyond specified limits results in unacceptable risk. Now, ISO 60601-1 covers a whole heap of safety and other parameters, but this is very specific to the clinical function. So,
can you give an example of that, Jeff?
Take, for example, if a device, let's take something very topical, a ventilatory respirator that's required for use for COVID-19 patients. An essential function of that device is it continues to operate and provides breathing support to the patient. Another critical parameter of that device is that it doesn't overpressurize and damage their lungs if they have lungs that are impaired. So those sort of parameters are essential performance of the device in delivering its clinical function, as opposed from safety functions such as no electrocution risk and no infection risk. And normally the essential performance will come down to quite a small number of items that are the key aspects of that device that it must do to perform its clinical function.
I know that accuracy is obviously one important one here. If you're sensing something and the accuracy of that measurement is not accurate, it could lead to a misdiagnosis.
Indeed. So it's essentially any aspect of the device that you as the conceiver and designer and developer of the device says, oh, it's extremely important that this device achieves that function and within certain parametric performance range. If you think that that is the case, then it's fairly likely that you are considering something that's part of essential performance. And I've got the dot point requirements traceability, which I touched on before. There is a formal requirement that any artifact that's generated through the process of developing a medical product is traceable back to a user need. That includes right through to verification and validation. So if you're validating that your green light comes on when the power's on with a certain brightness and intensity, you'll have tests to verify that, and they will need to be traceable back to the user need. The easiest way to do this is with a structured sequence of codes that each user need gets assigned a code, and then verification and validation of parameters against that user need identified by that code so that you can provide the traceability. You can do the traceability with a large Excel spreadsheet. There are third-party systems. For example, one's called Doors, which I believe is incredibly complicated to use.
It's Green Light Guru as well.
Green Light Guru doesn't really actually have a formal traceability facility that's all that effective, but you can use it. For the devices we use an Excel spreadsheet plus numerical codes that are cross-referenced through the documents and use that. Other people use large tables, but with all the requirements in great big tables. If you do that, you rapidly lose intelligibility for someone who just wants to understand what the needs are. If it's just a big amorphous table full of requirements. So there's no perfect way to skin a cat, but at the end of the day, you do need to have that traceability in place. And I would advocate the use of every requirement at every level in the documentation hierarchy as a numerical code, an alphanumerical code that is then cross-referenced to provide the traceability.
Sure. Okay, let's move on.
So we'll get into some of the detail here, and these are linked into the specific sections of 135 that refer to them. And these are steps in the process, so you notice they're slightly out of sequence. The control and development of changes is brought in primarily to refer to the product once it's on the market and how to track it. But it's really important to actually trace changes that occurred during the design process. So I've brought it to a higher level of consciousness sort of earlier in the thought process. The overall design controls really relies very heavily on plans, protocols and procedures. So at the start of the project, you need to have a thing called a design and development plan, which is effectively the master control document for the conduct of the project. And it's important to have that in place as early as possible. we create a draft of that right at the very start of the project, mainly so that it becomes a placeholder and an aide-memoire for things that you need to do along the way. And for example, it identifies all the documents that need to be produced. So you can then use it as a checklist as you go along.
So just to be clear, it's not a design and planning document for the management of the project. It's for the management of the design controls.
Well, it's effectively, it does incorporate project management aspects to it, but it's not in the form of a Gantt chart or a timeline. It is a document that prescribes the steps to be followed and the documentation to be generated along the way. And there are some quite specific requirements in those sections of ISO 13485 that define what need to be included. It's beyond the scope of what we can talk about today to get into the dirty detail of that, but it is quite complex, and I'd suggest anyone that really doesn't have experience of this really does need to seek some guidance and assistance in that. On the one hand, they may miss things out that are necessary. On the other hand, they might go for overkill and come up with something that's totally overblown beyond what's actually required. So there is a nice middle ground that's efficient, but meets the need.
And what do you mean by protocols and procedures?
Well, a procedure is how you go about doing something. It's generally used, the term of standard operating procedure is used quite frequently. I'm not a great fan of it. It's just a procedure for how you go about doing something. And 13485 requires documentation of procedures for doing things, and then you must follow those procedures when you do those things.
So these are engineering procedures, design procedures, or are we talking about documentation?
A whole range,
procedures?
yeah, all of the above.
Yeah.
Engineering procedures, procedures for design reviews, items such as risk management need procedures, documentation control, configuration control. So it really covers the whole gamut.
And protocol?
And well, a protocol is more a specific step-by-step way of doing things. So, for example, if you're undertaking verification testing, the protocol for that defines the specific steps that you follow. And it is in the form of a procedure, but it is specific to the particular device and the steps and procedures and protocols particular to that device. So it's a little more specific than what you'll find under your general quality system and standard operating procedures.
Just to make it real for our audience, can you give me that as an example of a real medical device?
Real medical device, I'll take the ventilator case.
Yeah.
So you might have a protocol for testing that would involve steps of setting the device up, measuring its power supply rails, making sure they're within specification to the design, making sure that the control of the valves to operate the pneumatics of the ventilator are operating as required, make sure that the timing sequences and cadences are correct. So you'll have a step-by-step process in the form of a protocol for each of these steps that you do, what you need to measure, what the pass-fail criteria are, what you need to record. So that's an example of the detail, which from what I've said goes much beyond what you'll have in just a standard quality system document that would be covering a whole different range of different types of product.
Okay.
To talk on the other points, design inputs, they're effectively technical specifications. So if you're used to, as an engineer, having a technical specification, that's essentially what the design inputs are. So they take your user need that you need an LED indicator for power, and they look at 60601-1 that says a power indicator must be green, and it defines things. What brightness level does it need because of its ambient lighting environment, or it needs to be visible, etc., etc. Those things are all design inputs that go into the technical design input specification.
And some of those design inputs I know come from standard. So you mentioned before that the green might have to be a particular wavelength of light to be the correct green, and that's specified in a whole range of standards.
That one actually, in fact, is not. 60601 just says green, so it's up to you to decide what green is. And this gets into an interesting debate about the use of yellow and red, which are for high-level alarms and lower-level alarms, specifically defined. What do you do with orange? It's not defined what orange should be. But when there's orange yellow and then there's orange red, so you end up with a few decisions you actually have to make beyond what the specifications actually tell you. As I hark on about to anyone who's prepared to listen, be really thankful when you have specifications in documents like 60601-1 it makes life a lot easier than having to make design decisions yourself.
I think that really illustrates, though, just how complex things get. As you get down to the devil in the detail, it's quite a complex process, isn't it?
A typical medium complexity device will have perhaps 50 to 100 user needs, and it might have 1,000 design inputs to fully define the technical requirements of that device. Okay. Each and every one of those design inputs has to be verified during verification testing. And the other dot points, project planning and management, once again, 60601-1 and 13485 prescribe that you must do these things. So you can't just say, oh, we don't have to worry about project management, we know what we're doing. It's actually called for as a requirement. And change management, also known as configuration control, you need to have a formal process for making sure that as changes occur through the project, be they to the user needs, design inputs, or to the design as implemented or to the software, all need to be tracked and managed. So you need a very rigorous... so Tim?
Is there a sign-off process? Like, who approves those changes?
Absolutely. It's mandatory that you have a sign-off process. The procedures that 13485 calls up are very heavily weighted towards risk management and also review. Both those risk management processes and review processes require formal sign-off at every step. So any change to any document needs to be formally reviewed and then signed off by someone of appropriate authority, which would typically be the most senior engineer involved in the project. It may be the principal engineer of the company, or it may be the quality manager of the company, the sign-off authorities.
What about something like
how significant the document is?
Going back to your medical example, you know, in terms of you can overinflate the lungs of a patient and damage their lungs or even kill them. You know, wouldn't that be a doctor who's sort of saying what that upper limit should be?
Yeah, indeed, you'd be looking to clinical specialists to give information. In that particular case, there are many standards that define that. So those parameters are well defined. But you may be developing a new device which there's no clinical specification. In that instance, you must rely upon clinical experts and their judgments and capabilities to define parameters. And in particular, when looking at risk management, they need to identify what the harms are. A harm is something that hurts somebody.
Yes, we're going to talk about harms.
We'll talk about that in detail.
We'll talk about harms in a bit. But just in terms of the sign-off process, if there is something like that where you do have a medical expert who's defining what is safe, is it that your documentation just needs to show that you've done your due diligence, consulted the right people, and you have to satisfy the regulatory approval authorities to their satisfaction? How does that work?
Well, there are certain requirements that are fairly well defined in standards, but then there are the requirements of the regulatory standards inspectors, and sometimes it's hard to judge what they will be and to what depth they will go. But looking at critical clinical parameters, they will go to a great deal of depth. And they'll be looking not just at opinions of people, they'll be wanting to find research, so you can come up with research documents on topics and the performance of perhaps similar products on the marketplace, clinical trials of other devices. You need to go to quite a deal of depth to justify why those parameters that you're specifying as required are in fact justified. Yeah. So you definitely need to seek out clinical expertise. And we're talking here about devices of maybe sort of class 2 type devices where they're moderately critical in terms of their clinical performance and stuff. For some of the simpler devices, it's a much easier thing, and you may have a predicate device that you can use for guidance, but particularly for the more complex or more risk-prone devices, you really need a fair bit of depth of exploration of these things, and to answer Tim's question, seeking out expert opinion.
Yeah. Okay, we better move on then.
Yes, we'll have to pedal a bit faster here. So moving on through the process, so once we've gone through the requirements capture and the planning and so forth and so forth, we actually get down and dirty into the design process and design and develop the product. And this is probably the part of the project that takes the most amount of horsepower and effort. And the end game of this is what's called design and development outputs. And they are not only the functioning working device and the hardware designs and software designs, but all of the documentation that goes with that, including the design descriptive documents, the planning and protocols required for verification, testing, verification, validation, etc., etc. All of these documents ultimately go into what's called the medical device technical file, which is the technical document compendium. It then itself becomes a part of the medical device file, which includes not only the technical documents, but verification and validation reports and risk management reports and all sorts of other documentary artifacts. So once again, that's a topic. Each of these slides I've brought up here, probably you could do a one-day workshop on. That's the sort of detail that is embedded beneath the surface here. What I'm trying to do today is just effectively introduce everyone to the concept of what's required, and of course many of the audience will be well familiar with this, but I'm guessing there'll be a few that don't. And also to share anecdotally what's a practical approach to this rather than getting too hung up in the technicalities. What do you really need to do and what really matters? So in terms of the dot points, the final dot point, design and development review. Throughout the development process, there is a requirement for multiple review points, definitely between stages of the development process, but also within stages. They need to be formal, need to be documented and minuted, preferably with formal agendas. There are also other reviews which can be more ad hoc. For example, engineering reviews may be a subset of the team dealing with a particular technical design issue, may only be 2 people involved. Once again, if you are reviewing something and making decisions as a result of a review of outcomes of a process, that should be documented and recorded in a formal manner, goes into the technical file. Then when the inspectors come along or your quality auditor and says, what reviews did you do? You've got a nice rich compendium of information to show them. Yes, we did do these reviews. We recorded them. We considered things. We had the necessary independent experts and scrutiny of those reviews, etc., etc.
And this whole documentation, it can lead to thousands of pages, can't it?
Tens of thousands of pages.
Right.
I had one customer that said they wanted the entire technical documentation of all the electronics and software we did in one document. I said, yeah, tens of thousands of pages in one document. I don't think so. It sounds formidable, but by the time you consider that that includes all of the software, all of the source code, all of the testing of the source code, all of the electronics hardware documents, bills of materials, etc., it adds up pretty quickly to a large amount of documentation that is simply generated as a part of the normal process.
And you mentioned, giving practical tips when you're dealing with that many documents. What are your tips for being as practical as possible?
Divide and conquer and insist that every participant in the process documents as they go along, don't leave the process to the end. Design engineers must document things as they progress and keep that documentation in a formal, orderly structure, not just scattergun all over the place. So
we might come back.
Compile it as you go along.
We might at the end, we'll just get through the slides, we might come back to this whole benefit of starting early and the drawbacks of the minimum viable product process. But let's move on. Verification and validation.
Yeah, so getting back to this document, and we've effectively gone down the diagonal path in the white boxes from the user needs right through to ultimately design outputs which go to the medical device in production. You show that verification occurs between design outputs and design input. To put it really simplistically, verification is proving that the device conforms with its design specification. Whereas validation is, say, does the device do what the user needs it to do?
Because this can really confuse people.
So in the ideal world, you think, well, what's the difference? Well, quite significantly, firstly, the specification might not be perfect, but the verification certainly is a very technical activity in terms of do the engineers confirm that what the engineer said the thing should do, it does. But from the user's point of view, completely different mindset. Used in a clinical setting, particularly if it's in an operating theatre or an intensive care unit, a high-stress environment with lots happening, the needs of the users of the device doing what it needs to do is much more than just the technical. It takes into account the usability and the functions and reliability, and a whole heap of other parameters.
Yeah, I can think of an example here because I did hear about this one. Is that in a surgical theatre, you might have a device that has a display on it, which he says, okay, we need some numbers displayed, but in a really bright surgical theatre with lots and lots of light shining on it, the glare on the screen can be such that you can't read the numbers. Yes. So yes, the engineers said the numbers were displayed. When you got in the operating theatres, actually you couldn't read the numbers.
Well, take a really simplistic example. Say I want to develop a hammer. So the design input will say the hammer shall have a head of steel of a certain dimension and a handle of a certain length and centre of gravity at a certain point. Well, I can verify that by making measurements on it. But then the validation says, can I use it to hammer a nail in?
Okay.
Well, touch why they're important. Well, I think the fact that they're called up by the regulatory standards is probably enough, but they also are extremely important in their own right if you want to develop a product that will be accepted by the marketplace. You could easily come up with a product that meets all of the requirements of ISO 13485 that the users won't use because they don't like the way it operates. So they're important from a much broader perspective than just regulatory compliance.
Is it a sort of a catastrophic thing if you get right to the end and find that a particular key function isn't adequate?
Well, not catastrophic, but the degree of catastrophe depends on how far down you are through the process till you discover the problem. The most extreme example is when you discover that in use in the field and you have a product recall. But the later on in the process you find problems, the worse you are off. For example, you might get to the design output stage and do verification. You might have expended a third of your budget. 2/3 of your budget might be reserved for clinical trials, validation. So if you can catch a problem at the design output stage by the verification process, and even in preclinical trials before the formal trials, that costs you a certain amount to fix. But if you go through your entire clinical trial process and discover a major problem, you may have to repeat the whole process.
Is there anything you can do to avoid this? And obviously you can't predict all scenarios, but
there's no 100% avoidance, but firstly, following the regulatory standards to the letter is a good pathway. Engage with the regulators often and early, and get on side with the regulators. Don't put that off to the end. Get pre-reviews done. The regulators will do this, but if you look at organisations, for example, we use TUV to do 60601-1 conformance. They will do a pre-review process, give you guidance before they do the formal review. So by a small amount of extra money, you can actually head off a large amount of extra money if you have a problem. So really having that continuous engagement with all of those stakeholders, starting as early as possible and keeping that going. Firstly, it builds trust. Secondly, you will then have inputs that help you avoid problems that don't crop up to right at the end.
Okay, we better move on.
So design transfer is really taking the outputs of the engineering, design and development work and establishing that in the production environment. What we see here is pick and place machines and the process for electronics assembly, but you can extrapolate this to any type of manufacturing or assembly environment. It is particularly important to consider that you have to validate the manufacturing process to show that it does what it's supposed to be doing. So this is distinct from validation of the design meeting a specification. This is actually validating that the manufacturing process does what it's supposed to do, and the design transfer, which is the engineering documents going into the manufacturing environment, are effective in allowing the manufacturer to make the device, use the appropriate components, make sure that the assembly process is reliable, make sure that the end-of-line production test process gives adequate test coverage so that every unit off the line is fully functional and capable, etc., etc. And it's also important to consider there are two pathways to validation. If you can verify the outputs of the process, you don't necessarily need to fully validate the process. But if you can't verify the outputs, you must validate the process. Good example is sterilisation, where you can't test every single unit to prove it's sterile because you have to breach the sterile barrier to make sure it's sterile. So you can't do that. Therefore, you have to actually validate the sterilisation process by testing to show that the process is highly reliable, then back that up with batch sampling, for example, to show that nothing's gone wrong. Once again, an extremely detailed topic to review in depth.
Okay, let's move on then.
We're kind of getting to the end here. Just to touch on risk, throughout the entire process of development, you must consider risk, starting at the beginning and following through to the very end. It is important to consider a few definitions, and these come from ISO 13485, which, when I say calls up ISO 14971, it doesn't do so explicitly. It effectively strongly hints at it, though. So common practice is to apply ISO 14971 throughout 13485 to not only the design and development process, but also to the quality system itself.
Just for anybody out there who's getting confused by all the acronyms and standard numbers, if you go to the community website and go to recordings and go to the introduction to active MedTech devices, then you'll get a bit of an overview of what all these different standards are.
Yeah, I guess I should have apologised. This is a very acronym-rich environment, and you'll notice I rattle these standards off the tip of my tongue. It's a case of gaining familiarity with them. You don't need to necessarily achieve that level of familiarity with all of them, but you certainly need to have a working knowledge of them and make sure that there are people in your group that do have the depth of knowledge required to apply them effectively.
So I don't think we need to read out all the definitions because people can see them. Is there anything you want to point out?
One I'd like to emphasise is the definition of risk. And risk is used as a broad term. You can consider commercial risk and technical risk and timescale risk and all sorts of other risks. But in considering within the context of ISO 125, it's important to apply it within the scope of that definition. So it pertains to safety or performance of the device, so risk of causing harm or injury to the patient, the user, or the environment. So it's very important to constrain consideration of risk to that definition. If you apply it more broadly, all you're doing is building in a world of pain into the process by applying the medical risk controls to risks beyond that they're intended to address. And I've just put a couple of the definitions in there just to bring all this together. These terms are defined, and it's extremely important to understand what the definition of those terms is and means, because they come all pervasive throughout the risk management process during your design and development.
These are the cause numbers in.
They're the cause numbers in 13485.
Move on.
Yes. Perhaps pass over to Tim on this.
Yeah, so look, obviously this is just massively complex, and is obviously why medical devices can be quite a major exercise for most people. I'm interested to know, who the first port of call is, because for some people it's the regulatory consultants, other people it's the quality consultants, sometimes the engineering, whether it's electronics or industrial design. What is just the best way of getting your head around all of this? Do people need to go do courses, and what's the best way of getting started with all this?
Courses are a good thing, but I'd actually counsel against doing too many detailed courses too early, because you won't get the takeaway from them that you will if you progress down the pathway and get a more deep understanding of what's involved before going to the course. There are certainly some very good introductory courses that are good to do early, but I wouldn't follow a process of saying, okay, I'll spend a month going to all the courses I can identify and try and learn from that, because you become totally bamboozled pretty quickly because you won't have a context to view the coursework under. Now, I would say at the start, certainly it's wise to engage with a regulatory consultant early and a quality system consultant early to set your pathways for your regulatory compliance planning on the one hand, and also establishing quality system on the other. But there is another approach. If you engage with specialist design firms for your electronics and software, your industrial design, and other aspects that you need to address, those consultants can actually serve to educate you along the way and bring their expertise to bear to assist you. To give you cause for hope, I am not a regulatory compliance expert, I'm not a quality system expert. I have gained knowledge on a practical way to apply these regulatory standards from the perspective of an electronics and software engineer, and by following the engineering process of learning what I need to know. I must admit I actually haven't done any formal coursework on any of these topics, so might regard my views with suspicion, but on the hand of that, when you get to a certain level of seniority or an experience in the profession, you follow a path of gaining information by a self-study approach and learning what you need to know from that. And throughout my career, I've been very intensely involved in applying regulatory standards. So reading a standard and understanding what it means and working out what's important is second nature. So engineers who are used to dealing with technical standards can adapt to this pretty easily. For those who aren't, it can be bamboozling, so you definitely need to seek assistance. But as I said, do that progressively as a learning process as you go along, and don't get too hung up on trying to do too much too early.
So if I can just come back to the MVP, to the startups, you know, in the audience, people who have this idea, and it's preached widely, is to start with a minimum viable product. And the temptation is just not to do any of this at the start. Get your initial prototype, proof of concept up and working, show it to investors, and get some, you know, traction, get some money, and bootstrap your way up the ladder, and then worry about all this later. You said previously that if you can begin with the end in mind, it's a much safer bet. So given that conflicting, you know, because there is that appeal of, you know, if you've got no money and you're just starting out, how can you do this in a way that's practical, that, you know, meets their own need to bootstrap themselves up without getting bogged down in the detail?
I think it gets back to apply good engineering design practice and approach it from that point of view. You can develop a minimum viable product in an excuse of French, a rip, shit and bust approach, where you simply throw discipline out the window and just go hell for leather trying to get something working. I fall back to our coffee mug here that relates to software in particular, but can be applied more broadly, where months of coding can save hours of planning. You go down a path where you don't do any basic planning consideration, and in particular capturing those all-important user needs, you can just go down stumbling down a path that leads you in the wrong direction. And for want of a little bit of consideration early on, you can have a much sounder pathway to the objective. Now, it's not a big stretch to expand that out, to do that within a framework of capturing basic design control information as you go along, as a way of just improving your development process. You're not really doing anything that a sound engineering approach would adopt anyway. It's just doing it with the knowledge of what the medical device design controls require, so that you're structuring the information so that it's usable later. In the worst case scenario, if you don't apply any controls to your minimum viable product, you may be consigning it to the waste paper bin and then starting again from scratch. That is in fact a real possible scenario that you can face if you are designing a medical device and don't take into account any of these considerations right from the start.
Okay, and that, I believe, brings us to the end of the formal presentation. I just would remind people that if they do have any questions, they can they can start typing them in now. And if you would like to contact Jeff Sizer, you can, the presenter today, in case you came a little bit late, the presenter today has been Jeff Sizer, the CEO of Genesis Design, one of the sponsors of this community. And my name is Tim Canagita. I'm the coordinator of the New South Wales Active MedTech community. My contact details are in the bottom right-hand corner there. So you can find your control panel, and there's a little Q&A button there. And so would like you to invite people to type in questions now. So I've got one question, and that is about the how do design controls relate to the quality system?
They're absolutely enmeshed in the quality system, because quality system requirements are defined by ISO 13485, which you'll have heard mentioned a few times today. And the clauses that I've referenced are the design control process from section 7 of ISO 13485. So they are inextricably enmeshed. So your design and development procedures under your quality system will define the requirements for design control. Incidentally, when you look at the applicability of the different sections of ISO 13485 to roles and activities of your organisation, not all organisations undertake all of the activities. For example, a manufacturer who does the actual box build and the assembly of the circuit boards might not be doing design and development. So some of those aspects don't apply, but certainly if you are, for example, a company like CircuitWise that's going to manufacture the devices, you're absolutely reliant that the developers have applied the design controls throughout the process so that the so-called design transfer documents you receive as a manufacturer meet the requirements. So even if your organisation doesn't have to undertake that part of the design control process, they will be dependent and reliant upon it.
Okay, thanks a lot. I've got another question here, which is how do you keep track of all the documents?
The process that we use here is to set up at the start of the process. We call it a hierarchy diagram, but it's essentially a structured representation of the items in the medical device, all of its component parts and sub-assemblies and printed circuit assemblies, etc. And we identify all the documents that are required as a part of the design control process to be generated. And we have that in a templated form, and we use that to actually create that list at the very start of the project. You might say, well, how can I possibly know what that needs to be when I haven't even started the development? Well, the answer is it's actually a pretty consistent and regular set of documents in terms of the principle behind the documents. The detail, of course, will depend on the particular device, but you know in principle what you need to generate. So you can come up with a list that you can create at the beginning and then start to add to and flesh out as you go along.